When I told people I was moving to the Philippines alone at 64, almost everyone had the same reaction. They thought I had lost my mind. It wasn't simply the idea of leaving America that worried them, it was the fact that I was doing it alone. No husband beside me, no boyfriend waiting at the other end, no family member making the move with me. Just 2 suitcases, a passport and a one-way ticket. And the strange thing was, I wasn't completely convinced they were wrong. For months I had been watching videos about life in the Philippines. I watched people walking through colorful markets, eating fresh seafood, buying tropical fruit, and talking about a slower, less expensive way of life. At first it was just something I watched in the evenings. Then it became something I started imagining. I pictured myself waking up somewhere warm, walking to a market in the morning, buying fresh food, and spending my retirement years somewhere that didn't feel like every day was running on a clock. The beaches were beautiful, of course, but they weren't what convinced me. It was the ordinary things. The markets, the little food stalls, the streets filled with people. The feeling that life happened outside instead of behind closed doors. Eventually, I realized I wasn't just watching videos anymore. I was planning a life. So I bought the ticket. And the moment I did, the fantasy became real. The first serious test came at the airport. I was standing at the airline counter when the agent looked at my passport, typed something into the computer, and then asked me a question I had been hoping I wouldn't hear. "Do you have proof of onward travel?" My stomach dropped. I knew travelers sometimes needed proof that they intended to leave the country, and fortunately I'd prepared for it. A few days earlier I'd purchased an onward ticket specifically for this reason. I pulled up the confirmation on my phone. She checked it, handed my passport back, and told me I was fine. It was a tiny moment. But as I walked away from that counter, I remember thinking, this is actually happening. There was no more imagining. No more watching someone else's life on a screen. I was going to the Philippines. Alone. A little later, I found myself sitting at the departure gate. And that's when the excitement began to disappear. The closer the flight got, the more nervous I became. For months I had been telling myself that I could do this. But now there was nothing left to plan. Soon I'd be sitting on an airplane, traveling thousands of miles away from everything familiar. I looked around the airport and suddenly wondered if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. What if I hated it? What if I became lonely? What if I couldn't adjust? What if everyone back home had been right? The flight seemed endless. I watched movies. I tried to sleep. I stared through the window. But my mind kept returning to the same questions. Eventually, the plane landed in Manila. And the first thing I noticed wasn't the scenery. It was the heat. The moment I stepped outside, the tropical air surrounded me. I knew the Philippines was warm. I had seen it in videos. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it are 2 completely different things. Within minutes I was sweating. Then came the next challenge. Communication. I'd known that English was widely spoken in the Philippines, so I hadn't expected language to be a major obstacle. And in many situations it wasn't. But people speak English doesn't mean every conversation is effortless. Sometimes everything was easy. Other times I found myself smiling, gesturing, repeating myself, and hoping the other person understood what I was trying to say. Even simple tasks suddenly required concentration. Ordering food, finding transportation, buying groceries, asking for directions. Things I'd done automatically for decades suddenly felt like small puzzles. By the time I reached my hotel that first night, I was exhausted. Not because I'd done anything physically difficult. My mind was simply overloaded. Every street was unfamiliar. Every sound was different. Every little decision required attention. And for the first time since buying that ticket, I seriously wondered whether I had made the wrong choice. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. Part of it was jet lag. The other part was my brain refusing to slow down. For a few seconds I forgot where I was. Then I opened my eyes and remembered. I was in the Philippines. And I was completely on my own. I got dressed, grabbed my phone and decided to walk outside. That simple decision ended up changing the way I saw the country. Almost immediately, I noticed something I hadn't expected. People acknowledged each other. Not everyone, of course, but enough that I noticed. A smile, a nod, a quick greeting, a small interaction between strangers. Back home, I could walk through a parking lot, a store, or an entire neighborhood without saying a word to anyone. Here, those little moments seemed more common. And when you're far away from home, small moments can mean more than you realize. I started noticing the things I'd only seen through my computer screen. Small shops, tricycles, street vendors, fruit stands, children playing, people sitting outside and talking. For months, I'd watched videos of these places from my living room. Now I was standing inside the scene. That morning, I discovered a local market. It wasn't glamorous. There were no polished signs or expensive displays. Just vendors selling fruit, vegetables, fish, and meat. I walked around once. Then again. Then a third time. I wasn't even looking for anything specific. I was fascinated. The mangoes looked incredible. There were fruits I'd never seen before. Vegetables I couldn't identify. And fish that looked so fresh I wondered whether they had been caught that very morning. I bought a few things and tried to make my way back. The transaction took much longer than it probably should have. Part of that was because I was still learning. Part of it was because I was nervous. But when I finally returned to my hotel, I felt strangely proud. I hadn't done anything extraordinary. I'd simply bought groceries. But I had done it alone. Back home, grocery shopping had been something I barely noticed. Here it felt like an achievement. And that became the pattern of my first few weeks. Every day brought another small victory. I learned a new street. I figured out transportation. I discovered another market. I found a restaurant I liked. I learned which places were easier to navigate. Little by little, the country stopped feeling completely unfamiliar. But there were challenges too. The heat was relentless. I'd walk outside for 20 minutes and return feeling as if I'd spent the afternoon exercising. I quickly learned that the middle of the day wasn't the best time for long walks. Then there was the pace of everyday life. Things that would have taken 10 minutes back home could sometimes take an hour. At first that frustrated me. I wanted things done immediately. I wanted everything to work according to my schedule. Then one afternoon I realized something. The Philippines wasn't asking me to hurry. I was the one bringing that habit with me. So I started slowing down. And that was when I began to notice something deeper about the country. People didn't always seem to be in a race. Families sat together. Friends talked over meals. People laughed. They spent time with each other. They weren't constantly looking at the clock. They weren't always rushing toward the next appointment. There was a different rhythm to everyday life. At first it felt strange. Then it felt peaceful. For years, even during retirement, I had lived as though I was still late for something. And slowly I began wondering why. Maybe I hadn't moved to the Philippines simply to find a cheaper place to live. Maybe I had come here to discover what life felt like when I stopped rushing through it. But just when I thought I was becoming comfortable, another feeling appeared. One I hadn't expected. Loneliness. It didn't happen every day. Sometimes I could go for hours without thinking about it. But then something small would trigger it. I'd see a family eating together. I'd experience something interesting and instinctively reach for my phone to call someone. I'd hear a familiar song. Or I'd simply have one of those quiet evenings when the apartment felt too silent. And suddenly I remembered how far away I was. Thousands of miles from the people and places I'd known for most of my life. That was the part of moving overseas nobody could fully explain to me. You can be surrounded by people and still miss home. And at 64, starting over wasn't always easy. I had spent decades building routines. Favorite stores, favorite restaurants, familiar streets, people who knew me. In the Philippines, I was starting again. But something was happening underneath all that uncertainty. Every problem I solved by myself made me a little stronger. Every unfamiliar situation I handled reminded me that I was more capable than I'd been giving myself credit for. And eventually, I began to understand that this journey wasn't really about the Philippines at all. It was about me, and the person I had forgotten I could still become. For years, I had quietly accepted the idea that certain experiences belonged to younger people. Starting over, moving across the world, learning a completely different way of life, taking risks. I had never consciously decided that those things were no longer for me. They had simply disappeared from my list of possibilities. Then I moved to the Philippines. And suddenly I was doing all of them. One day I was sitting in a small cafe watching people walk past. A few months earlier, I would have been comparing everything I saw to America. I would have been asking myself whether the food was better, whether the streets were easier, whether Ife was more convenient. But that day I noticed something. I wasn't comparing anymore. I wasn't wondering whether I'd made a mistake. I wasn't counting the days until I could go home. I was simply sitting there, living. That realization surprised me. Because without noticing it, the Philippines had stopped feeling like an experiment. It had become normal. Not perfect. Not stress-free. Just normal. And somehow, that felt more meaningful than anything else. Around that same time, the questions from people back home began to change. When I first arrived, everyone wanted to know the basics. How's the food? How's the weather? Do you feel safe? Are you lonely? Have you met anyone? But after several months, the questions became more serious. So, are you staying? At first, I didn't know how to answer. When I'd left America, I had told myself that I was simply trying something different. If it didn't work, I could always go back. That thought had made the whole decision easier. It meant I wasn't really committing to a permanent new life. I was just testing one. But months had passed. I had favorite restaurants, favorite walking routes, favorite vendors. I knew where to buy the fruit I liked. I knew where to get groceries. I knew how to move around the area without constantly checking my phone. Without realizing it, I had created routines. And routines have a strange power. They turn unfamiliar places into familiar ones. They turn unfamiliar streets into streets you recognize. They turn strangers into familiar faces. And eventually, they turn a place into home. Then one morning, something happened that showed me how much I had changed. I woke up feeling unwell. It wasn't anything dramatic, but it was enough that I needed to see a doctor. Back in America, I would have known exactly what to do. I would have known where to go, who to call, how the system worked. Here I wasn't completely sure. And for a moment the old fear returned. But something was different this time. I didn't panic. I started asking questions. I found out where I needed to go. I arranged transportation. I visited a clinic. And I handled the entire situation. Afterward, I sat quietly and thought about what had just happened. The medical problem itself wasn't the important part. The important part was how I had reacted. A year earlier, that situation might have terrified me. Now I'd simply figured it out. And that's when I realized what this entire journey had actually been about. It wasn't really about retirement. It wasn't even about moving overseas. It was about proving something to myself. I was still capable of adapting, capable of learning, capable of making mistakes, capable of being uncomfortable, and capable of finding my way through situations I had never experienced before. For years, I had unknowingly placed limits on myself. Not because someone had told me I couldn't do certain things, but because life had become comfortable, predictable, safe. And when life becomes predictable for too long, you can forget what it feels like to challenge yourself. You stop asking what you're capable of. You stop testing your limits. You stop discovering new parts of yourself. Moving to the Philippines changed that for me. It reminded me that growth doesn't have an expiration date. Neither does adventure. And neither does courage. People sometimes ask me whether moving to the Philippines was the best decision I ever made. But honestly, I don't think that's the right question. Every major decision comes with trade-offs. There are things I miss about America. Friends, family, certain foods, certain conveniences, the comfort of knowing exactly how everything works. And the Philippines isn't perfect. No country is. There are difficult days. There are frustrating moments. There are things that still feel unfamiliar. But if someone asks me whether I regret getting on that airplane, the answer is simple. No, not for a second. Because somewhere between the nervous woman sitting alone at an airport gate and the woman I became months later, something changed. I developed a different kind of confidence. Not the confidence that comes from knowing exactly what will happen. That's impossible. It's the confidence that comes from knowing that even when something goes wrong, you'll figure it out. And that is a completely different kind of strength. When I first arrived, I thought I was searching for a new place to live. I thought I was searching for warmer weather, fresh markets, a slower lifestyle, maybe a more affordable retirement. But I discovered something much more important. I discovered that I could still begin again. Even at 64. Even alone. Even thousands of miles from everything familiar. I could still learn. I could still change. I could still surprise myself. And perhaps that is the lesson I wish more people understood. You don't have to be 25 to start over. You don't have to have everything figured out before you take the first step. And you don't have to wait until you're completely fearless. Because I wasn't fearless when I left. I was scared. I questioned myself. I wondered whether I'd made a terrible mistake. But I went anyway. And sometimes courage isn't about feeling certain. Sometimes courage is simply moving forward while you're still uncertain. Today, when I think about that woman sitting at the airport gate, I almost want to tell her something. I'd tell her that the heat will be difficult. The unfamiliar streets will be frustrating. There will be lonely evenings. There will be moments when she misses everything she knows. There will be days when she wonders why she ever left. But I'd also tell her something else. Keep going. Because one day you'll wake up and realize you aren't trying to survive a new life anymore. You're living it. You'll recognize the streets. You'll know where to shop. You'll have favorite places. You'll recognize familiar faces. You'll sit in a cafe and realize you're no longer thinking about going home. And that's the moment you'll understand. You didn't simply move to another country. You gave yourself permission to become someone new. At 64, I thought I was beginning the final chapter of my life. What I eventually discovered was something completely different. It wasn't the final chapter. It was simply a new one. And perhaps the greatest surprise wasn't the Philippines. It wasn't the markets. It wasn't the food. It wasn't the warm weather. It wasn't even the slower pace of life. The greatest surprise was realizing that I still had more life in me than I had imagined. I still had places to discover, things to learn, mistakes to make, people to meet, and experiences I had once believed were no longer meant for someone my age. So if there's one thing this journey taught me, it's this. Never assume your best days are behind you simply because you've reached a certain age. Life doesn't suddenly stop offering possibilities because you're 60, or 64, or 70. Sometimes the biggest adventure begins precisely when you think you're too old to have one. I left America with 2 suitcases and a one-way ticket. I thought I was moving to the Philippines. But in a strange way, I was actually moving toward a version of myself I hadn't met yet. And that may have been the greatest surprise of all.